All right, today we're recapping 5.2, which is, as you guys learned, all about um, compound interest. So we're going to learn, we're going to complicate things a little bit with compound interest. We learned how to do simple interest last time, where it was just interest was principal times rate times time, and then we added that interest onto our principal amount to find future value. Now we're going to grow on that because not every loan you borrow or money you borrow or bank accounts and stuff like that, not all of them are going to be using simple interest. A lot of times banks will use compound interest when calculating interest that you owe or interest that you gain on your savings account. So compound interest deals with specifically accounts or loans or credit cards, whatever, that will be using daily, monthly, weekly, what else we have? Quarterly, daily, monthly, weekly, quarterly, maybe semi-annually. Or even yearly. As soon as you go to yearly, it essentially becomes simple interest if the compounding period is yearly. But we can also have bi-weekly. So these are some different keywords that we might see, and we can talk about some of those as we do the problems and examples. A lot of them are pretty straightforward. Daily is compounded every single day, which means every year it'll be 365 times because there are 365 days in a year. Monthly will be compounded monthly, which means it'll be compounded 12 times a year. Weekly, does everyone know how many weeks are in a year?
52, I believe.
Thank you. 52 in a year. Or I'll just put the number 52 next to it. Weekly is going to be 52. Quarterly, do we know what quarterly is? How many times a year would that be? What is a quarter generally associated with?
Four.
4. Good, perfect. I saw you in the chat as well. I just want people to speak up. Semi-annually. What does semi-annually sound like?
Once a year.
No, yearly would be once a year, right? What about semi-annually?
Twice.
Yeah. Semi-annually is going to be twice a year. I'm just going to put a 2 next to it. So the red numbers are how many times a year this happens, right? So daily is 365. Monthly is 12, if you want to add all of the little red numbers for each one. And then bi-weekly. What is bi-weekly? That's how a lot of jobs will pay employees.
Every 2 weeks.
Every 2 weeks. So how many times would that be in a year if it's every 2 weeks? Because we want to know how many times this happens in a year.
26 times.
Good. 26 times a year. It'll be half as many as the weekly, right? Because if we're doing every other week, that'll be bi-weekly, which will be 26 times a year. Cool. So we have all of those keywords, which will show up in the examples that we work on, and we will use those numbers. The red numbers are N. Red numbers are going to be N in a lot of our formulas. That's how many times a year things are compounded. So let's start with the comparison between simple interest and compound interest. So simple interest, using simple interest, our future value equation. Now we had 2 equations last time. I had the P plus I, and then I gave you a different formula for I, right? I'm going to join those together here, and we're going to just use one formula, one equation for future value, which will be P times 1 plus R times T. we're also going to write down a formula for compound interest. Which will be future value equals P times 1 plus I to the NT, and that little I is R over N. Do I want to do that? I don't want to do that. Erase. Never mind. We're just going to put the R over N in here. Because if you ever Google compound interest, you'll find it like this. And the I is a little confusing. I don't know if the video used I or not, but let's not use the little I. So what are some things in here? We recognize some of these letters, right? We have the P. Those are the same thing. That's our principal amount, the amount borrowed, or the amount that we placed in the bank. That's the starting amount. We have the R. The R's are the same thing, right? That's our interest rate that's given in the question. Either the interest rate on what we borrowed or the interest rate that the bank is going to pay you for keeping your money there. The T is the same, right? The T is time, always in years. The only extra thing in this formula is the N, right? And I already told you what N was. It's the red numbers. N is going to be, let me write down what N is, number of times compounded in 1 year. So it is all of these red numbers that we talked about in the top right corner. It's number of times compounded in 1 year. So the question will usually tell you that you're borrowing money compounded weekly or compounded daily or compounded weekly or monthly. So you use the red number that we determined for each of those things for the N. Everything else is the same. The R is whatever the interest rate is in decimal form. T is the number of years. It has to be in years. And then P is going to be our principal, the starting amount that we begin with. Okay? So this formula is how we compute future value for a compound interest question. And you'll see in the in-class worksheet that the questions will say, the examples will say compounded monthly, yearly, weekly, whatever, something like that. The second thing I want to talk about, so that's our formula that we're going to use for that. The second thing I want to talk about is APY, which is the annual percent yield. The APY comes from when you borrow money, let's say, and it's an interest rate that's compounded monthly, right? That's going to be compounded 12 times a year, and that interest rate that is given to you in the question kind of describes how it's being compounded every month. So that interest rate is like a monthly interest rate almost. APY is kind of a conversion from that monthly compounded loan to what it would be if it was a yearly loan, or if it was done using a yearly simple interest calculation. So what we're going to do in the APY calculation is we'll start with these two equations and we'll set them equal to each other because they're both future value equations. So we'll start with P times 1 plus RT. Now you're not going to have to do this every time. I'm just showing you where this begins, and then we'll have a simplified version of this in a second that we'll work with, right? So if we have something like this to begin with, if we're trying to convert a compound interest to a simple interest rate, if we're trying to find what the rate would be in a simple interest situation, we can just simplify some of these things. For example, the principal money that we start with for the calculation would be the same on both sides. So we are going to just divide both sides by P to get rid of that. quick note. I'm going to put a little subscripts on these R's as R1 and R2 because those are different rates. The rate on the left side here, this rate is going to be a simple interest rate, and the rate over here is the compound interest rate. So this is like the monthly rate, and we're trying to find the yearly rate for that. So those R's are different.
Is that I or 1?
It's a 1. It's a 1 and a 2 for the subscripts. The other thing we can kind of eliminate here is the T, because when we're doing this conversion from compound interest to simple interest, we're doing everything in terms of 1 year. So I'm going to say get rid of the T and replace it with a 1. Again, this is a 1, not an I. So once we do that, we will have a 1 plus R, we'll call it R1, equals 1 plus R2 over n to the n power. And this is the simplified version of that equality because we've gotten rid of the p's. We got rid of the t because it's equal to 1. Little notes for us here. This R is what we're solving for. So solve for this R1. And we can do that, I guess, in terms of the equation. And we can say R1, which is what we're looking for in the APY calculation. So APY calculation is find R1, if you want to make a note to yourself. R1 is going to be this 1 plus R2 divided by n raised to the n power, and then a minus 1 at the end, because I took this plus 1 and I subtracted it to the other side, right? I subtract 1 from both sides. This is going to be the how to find APY by plugging in R2 and n from the given question. So the question will have some kind of interest rate compounded monthly, yearly, daily, weekly, something like that. And they'll give you a rate, which will go into R2. And they'll give you the keyword of monthly or weekly or daily, which will determine what your n is going to be. So once you plug in your R2 and your n, you can just plug this into a calculator and figure out what your APY is going to be. So this is APY is equal to this R1. Are there any questions?
I actually had a quick question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So is it always just gonna give us the R2 at the end, or will we have to somehow find a calculation for that as well?
No, if you have the in-class worksheet,
Oh, yeah, I do.
Number 5 is what the APY calculation problem is on today's in-class handout. So the in-class handout gives you a nominal rate of 12%. That's the R2 in that situation.
Okay.
And then
Right,
it'll say
thank you.
compounded quarterly, monthly, or daily, and that'll determine what the N is going to be. So the question will directly give you R2 and N, right? Our
Alright,
goal is to
thank you.
find... You're welcome. Yeah, I can scroll up for the numbers at the top. Are there any other questions?
Will we always have to do the top 2 P calculations and then cancel them out, or can we just automatically get the bottom last one that you showed us, where we can just put it in?
You can just start with this formula, yes. I was just showing you how that comes about. It comes about from like these two both being future value. And so you set them equal to each other and you do this calculation. That's just where this came from. I didn't want to just give you a formula without showing you where it comes from. Any other questions? I like all these questions. They're very good. If there's a question about a homework problem, I know I see one in chat. I can come to your room, or you can stay behind once the breakout rooms are open, and I can help you with that. Then, will we be able to have notes for the test? We will probably not do full open notes, but we'll probably do like a flashcard of some kind, like a 3x5 inch flashcard that you can make for next week's exam. Most of these equations, can these be plugged into a calculator? I'm not sure what you're asking, but yes, once you plug in the numbers, you should be able to put this into a calculator and get a number for that. The exam is in person. You can put whatever you want on your flashcard for the exam. Formulas would be useful. And yes, this lesson is being recorded and posted to Canvas. Formulas will not be on the exam as far as I know. I can double check my exams real quick. See if there was one. Or maybe I can't. Why is it not showing me? No, there are no formulas on the exam. So that's what the point of the flashcard, the 3-inch by 5-inch flashcard will be. You can put any formulas that you think are useful for you on that flashcard so you don't have to memorize them. Let me stop recording.